Ladies and gentlemen, there are questions in life that spark curiosity, and then there are questions that set entire worlds on fire. Today, I want to explore one of those questions with you. Not through rumor, not through gossip, but through the deep architecture of what it means to think, to build, to love, and to be human. Behind every extraordinary mind, behind every empire built not on sand but on innovation, there often exists a force so subtle, so profound, that it rarely makes the headlines. We speak of technology, rockets, cars, artificial intelligence, cities on other planets. But we rarely speak of the silent catalysts, the human relationships that sculpt those visions into something real. When the world sees $1 billion idea, I see a web of experiences, emotional anchors, unseen hands steadying a trembling dream when the world calls it impossible. What fascinates me is not just how someone builds rockets or electric cars, but what ignites that fire, what sustains it in the long, sleepless nights when everything seems to collapse. And if we look closely, there's almost always someone, a singular presence, that doesn't appear in financial reports, doesn't sit in boardrooms, doesn't sign billion-dollar contracts. But she is there, a quiet architect of courage. I've spent years analyzing how the human brain adapts under extreme pressure, how creative cognition works when someone is not merely solving problems, but trying to rewrite reality. In neuroscience, we know that the human brain isn't simply a lone computing machine. It's an ecosystem shaped continuously by emotional bonds and psychological anchors. High-stakes innovation is not just built on intelligence, it's built on emotional resilience. And emotional resilience almost always has a story behind it. Let me tell you something that the world often overlooks. Genius doesn't operate in isolation. It requires an environment where the impossible feels slightly less impossible. And sometimes that environment is embodied in one person. Not as a savior, not as a fairy tale figure, but as a mirror, one that reflects back your highest potential when the world only sees flaws. For years, people have tried to decode how certain individuals can sustain impossible workloads, brutal criticism, and visionary pursuits that stretch across industries. And while the public eye looks for the secret in IQ, technology, or management style, the real fuel is often hidden in something far less measurable. Neuroscience has a term for this: emotional scaffolding, the invisible framework of support that allows a mind to stay elevated without collapsing under its own weight. This isn't about romance in a superficial sense. It's about the psychological infrastructure of human greatness. It's about the woman whose presence stabilizes the chaos. She is not defined by his fame or his achievements, but by the way she can look at a storm and see beyond it. She doesn't need to be in the spotlight. She doesn't need her name etched on the wall. She just knows that when you're building a future that doesn't exist yet, you need someone who believes in it before the world does. I remember a night, years before rockets pierced the upper atmosphere or electric cars changed the market, when doubt nearly won, not the kind of doubt you confess in interviews, but the kind that lives in silence, that claws at your mind at 3 a.m., whispering that maybe this is the moment to stop. The weight of impossible timelines, failing prototypes, hostile critics. It's a pressure that can turn brilliance into a black hole. And in that moment, it wasn't the equations that saved the vision. It wasn't the funding or the PR strategy. It was the voice of someone who simply said, "Keep going." Not because she had the technical blueprint, but because she saw the human beneath the ambition. That is the thing about extraordinary women who stand behind extraordinary minds. They understand that innovation isn't built in labs alone. It's built in the spaces between breaths, in the quiet exchanges that no one else witnesses, in the courage that's borrowed from love when logic falters. The brain, in its complexity, craves stability to reach its highest potential. When cognitive demand skyrockets, as it does when you're simultaneously changing multiple industries, the prefrontal cortex begins to operate under intense metabolic load. Stress hormones rise, decision fatigue creeps in, rational thought narrows. But when there is emotional grounding, when the mind feels anchored, safe, creative cognition expands. Dopamine pathways stabilize, neuroplasticity increases. Risk becomes less paralyzing, more purposeful. It's not magic, it's biology. We glorify intellect, but it is the emotional architecture that decides whether that intellect endures or burns out. And sometimes, that architecture is one person. She is not there to fix the problem. She is there to remind you that the world you're building is still worth building when everything else screams otherwise. Think about it, the greatest leaps in human history. Whether it's stepping on the moon, splitting the atom, mapping the genome, didn't emerge from a vacuum of solitary genius. They emerged from networks of belief. And belief often begins with just one person standing beside you when no one else will. There is something extraordinary about the way one woman can transform how a mind operates. Not through grand gestures, but through constancy. Through understanding the storm without trying to control it. Through loving not the hero the world sees, but the human that bleeds in silence. I often think about the fragility of human brilliance, how easily it can be broken, and how incredibly rare it is for it to be sustained across decades, across failures and triumphs. We like to say, "Hey, change the world." But the truth is, no one does it alone. Behind every, "he changed the world," there is often a, "she held the world steady when it almost fell apart." I've studied brain scans of innovators under pressure. The patterns are astonishing. Those who have strong, trusted emotional bonds, romantic or otherwise, display markedly lower amygdala hyperactivation under stress. Their problem-solving areas stay lit longer. Their capacity to persevere doesn't just come from willpower, it comes from neurological reinforcement. It's as if the brain, knowing it's not alone, decides to push further. And this is the quiet truth no business magazine or stock chart will ever tell you. That woman is not just a presence, she's a neurological amplifier. She doesn't just stand behind brilliance, she amplifies it. We tend to romanticize genius as a solitary force, but the neuroscience tells a different story. The prefrontal cortex, where we plan, imagine, and innovate, performs at its peak when stress is buffered by trust. This buffering isn't hypothetical, it's measurable. Oxytocin release counteracts cortisol, creating what scientists call psychological safety zones. Inside those zones, the brain dares to take risks it would otherwise avoid. That's why the story of a mind that moves industries is incomplete without acknowledging the woman who becomes that safety zone. She doesn't code the algorithms. She doesn't launch the rockets. But without her, the algorithms might have remained in notebooks, the rockets on drawing boards. She understands what the world doesn't. That behind visionary leadership is a human heart, trying to survive the pressure of being seen as more than human. She doesn't need credit, because her power was never in being seen. It was in seeing. And that's the paradox of extraordinary women behind extraordinary men. Their impact is often invisible yet irreplaceable. They don't just support a dream, they shape the emotional terrain where that dream can take root. I've walked through factories at midnight, feeling the weight of thousands of futures on my shoulders. I've stood on launch pads where silence was heavier than thunder. And in those moments, when ambition teeters on the edge of collapse, it isn't applause that steadies you. It isn't headlines. It's knowing there's someone who sees you not as a symbol, but as a soul. Someone who can remind you that you are still allowed to be human, even while building the future. We underestimate how much emotional safety powers innovation. But ask any neuroscientist, and they'll tell you, the human brain is not designed to sustain extreme cognitive load in isolation. It needs emotional co-regulation. It needs to feel seen to keep imagining. This woman, the one history might forget to name, is often the anchor point of that co-regulation. She doesn't operate in the boardroom, but in the space where the mind decides whether to keep going or give up. She whispers courage when logic fails. She sees possibilities when vision blurs. She becomes the gravity holding the orbiting chaos together. The world might see steel and silicon, but behind it often lies a heartbeat that isn't on the cover of magazines. And that heartbeat is not just love. It's the architecture of resilience. I once asked a neuroscientist why some innovators sustain their fire for decades while others burn out early. The answer wasn't IQ. It wasn't luck. It was emotional architecture. Those with trusted, stable, profound bonds are neurologically more capable of carrying the weight of sustained vision. It's not a motivational poster. It's hardwired into the human nervous system. What fascinates me is how that architecture can exist quietly, humbly, without fanfare. She doesn't walk the stage, but she holds up the world that the stage stands on. And when I speak about the woman behind $1 billion mind, I'm not speaking of a muse in some shallow, cinematic sense. I'm speaking of the rare kind of presence that merges with your neural circuitry. Her belief isn't decorative. It's foundational. It shapes how neurons fire, how ideas survive, how courage is replenished. She is the kind of woman who doesn't need the world to understand her role, because she understands something deeper. Revolutions don't just happen in factories or boardrooms, they begin in hearts. Her quiet strength becomes the invisible architecture of empires. She may never touch the machinery, but her presence is the reason the machinery keeps running. There's a moment in every extraordinary journey when doubt tries to dismantle everything, when the equations don't add up, when the rocket refuses to leave the launch pad, when investors pull out, critics mock, and the world seems to shrink around a single question: is this still worth it? And in that moment, when every external voice echoes with uncertainty, her voice is the only constant. It doesn't shout, it doesn't demand, it simply reminds the mind why it began in the first place. I've stood in those moments. I've felt the silence of empty hangars after failure, the cold metal, the smell of burnt fuel, the weight of disappointment. But I've also felt the warmth of one hand held tightly, saying without words, "This is not where the story ends." And that whisper, often softer than the sound of failure, is what turns collapse into continuation. This is the quiet science of human perseverance. Emotional bonds change brain states. Oxytocin doesn't just make us feel safe, it makes the brain more adaptive. It enhances the ability to see patterns, to remain curious under pressure, to keep imagining when most minds shut down. Love, in its truest form, isn't just an emotion. It's a cognitive superpower. It transforms the neural landscape into something far more resilient. We often think of resilience as a solo act, but true resilience, sustained decade after decade, is communal. It's born in connection. And when that connection is profound, it creates an unshakable feedback loop. Your courage feeds off their belief, and their belief fuels your courage. Imagine a launch day. The sky is clear. The world is watching. Billions of dollars are on the line. Failure is not just a technical risk, it's a personal one. Every decision, every calculation, every sleepless night converges into a single moment. On the outside, it looks like pure logic. But inside, beneath the layers of precision, is something deeply human. There's a face in the crowd, sometimes unseen by cameras, that represents everything you're fighting for. That presence doesn't build the rocket, but it builds the mind that dares to launch it. Throughout history, innovation has always carried a hidden heartbeat. Behind the towering achievements of men celebrated as visionaries, there have been women who absorbed the storms, translated the silence, and gave those men the freedom to keep imagining. And when I speak about this woman, I'm not idealizing her. I'm acknowledging the truth science confirms: emotional grounding enhances cognitive endurance. In the brain, when you're facing overwhelming uncertainty, the amygdala reacts like an alarm system. It pushes fear, floods the system with cortisol, constricts your field of vision. But when you feel anchored, when love is present, stable, and trusted, the alarm doesn't shut down your mind, it sharpens it. It recalibrates it. That's why some innovators keep going when others crumble. It's not because they're superhuman, it's because they have someone who makes them feel human. The woman behind $1 billion mind is not defined by how the world sees her. She's defined by how she steadies the one who carries the weight of impossible dreams. Her strength is quiet, and that's what makes it unbreakable. I've always believed that the future is built not by machines, but by people who dare to imagine a different world. But imagination, like a flame, needs shelter. It needs protection from the winds of doubt. It needs someone who cups their hands around it when the storm comes. She is that shelter. You see, love in its highest form isn't passive. It's an active force. It stands at the intersection of chaos and hope. It doesn't solve every problem, but it creates the conditions for solutions to emerge. It doesn't guarantee success, but it gives the courage to face failure without breaking. She understands the cost of the dream, not in dollars, but in sleepless nights, in sacrifices that no one else sees. She watches the mind she loves being torn between impossible timelines and boundless ambition, and she doesn't try to tame it. She holds space for it, and that is something the world rarely acknowledges. We celebrate the launch, but not the hands that steadied the builder. We celebrate the genius, but not the heart that kept that genius alive. We measure impact in patents and revenue, but rarely encourage borrowed from someone else's belief. I've seen how her presence changes everything, not through grand declarations, but through the smallest, quietest acts. A look that says, "I see you," when the world only sees the brand. A touch that reminds you you're not your failures. A silence that feels like home when everything else feels like a battlefield. That's not poetic exaggeration, that's neuroscience. Those small, consistent moments regulate the nervous system, allowing the mind to keep expanding instead of collapsing. What makes her extraordinary is not that she saves the dream, but that she believes in it when it's most fragile. She is the only one who understands the weight without needing it explained. That understanding becomes a kind of language that doesn't require words. And in a world built on noise, that kind of quiet is rare. When a mind like this tries to build a future, it doesn't just need strategy. It needs sanctuary. It needs a human force that reminds it why the future matters. She is that force. She doesn't live in headlines. She lives in the spaces between breakthroughs, the invisible heartbeat of every step forward. And make no mistake, her story is not a supporting role. It is an integral chapter in the narrative of progress. She may not stand on stage, but her presence is in every word spoken. She may not sign contracts, but her fingerprints are on every risk taken. I've often thought about how the human brain holds both fragility and infinite potential. One harsh word, one devastating failure can collapse everything. But one voice saying, "I believe in you," at the right moment can resurrect entire futures. That's how empires survive their darkest nights, not through sheer force, but through shared belief. She is not just a muse. She is a force of nature, quiet but relentless. She's the gravitational center around which chaos organizes itself into vision. And the extraordinary thing is, she doesn't need the world to applaud her. She knows her power is not in being seen, but in seeing. That's the paradox of love at the level of vision. Building it is invisible to most, but indispensable to everything. There's a strange comfort in knowing that even the most audacious minds in the world are still human. That behind every staggering achievement, there is a heartbeat that no machine can replicate. That even the architects of tomorrow still need someone who can look at them and say, "You're not alone." I think about the first time a great idea is born. It's not loud. It doesn't come with a press release or $1 billion valuation. It's usually whispered late at night, almost too fragile to say out loud. And the first person who hears it, really hears it, has the power to either let it die or make it immortal. She chooses the latter. She doesn't just listen, she believes. And belief, real unwavering belief, has a gravity of its own. It pulls futures into existence. We often say that the future belongs to those who dare to build it. But maybe, just maybe, the future also belongs to those who dare to believe in the builders. Her story is woven into the fabric of every triumph, though history may never record her name. She is the steady pulse behind the boldest heartbeat. She is the quiet force behind the loudest ideas. And when the world sees $1 billion mind, what it's really witnessing is a mind made unbreakable by love. This woman is not a footnote in the story of innovation. She is the unspoken prologue, She is the moment before the spark, the silence before the storm, the heartbeat beneath the metal and algorithms. She is the proof that even the grandest visions are, at their core, profoundly human. The most astonishing thing isn't the rockets or the cars or the AI. It's that all of this, all of it, begins with two people in a room, one daring to dream and the other daring to believe. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the real secret behind every so-called impossible future. It's not just intellect, it's not just capital, it's love. The kind of love that doesn't fade in the face of failure, the kind that doesn't seek credit, the kind that simply builds a world inside one heart so another can build a world outside it. She is not behind the mind, she is within it. That is the woman behind $1 billion mind.